Howdy, this is Layman Pascal, and you're on the Integral Stage. Welcome back to our extremely popular AI cinema podcast, where today we'll be transitioning from Game B to B-grade motion pictures with burgeoning screenwriter Jim Rutt in his new film, Beneath the Petals of Betrayal. Hi, Jim.
Hey, Layman. Great to be back on your show. Always fun.
So this is the 7th episode of a series that we usually call The Soul of AI, but in deference to your performative anti-mysticism, I'll just call it Issues Related to Systemic Complexity with Emerging Digital Tools. And one of those issues is job replacement. The Writers Guild of America has been on strike in part to get legal guarantees that large corporations won't simply replace them completely with chatbots. Based on your experience trying to automate a screenplay, are they right to be concerned?
Well, it's certainly an issue. I'm working on a program I call Script Helper, and you can read about it on Medium. I've got a pretty detailed essay up there about it. Script Helper -001, Jim Rutt, Medium. That'll probably find it. And my take, at least at the current state of the art, is holy moly. And I've run this by some people with real screenwriting experience. One of my partner in this thing is a screenwriter. And while it is not intended to replace people currently, it's got heavily humans in the loop. What it is a gigantic productivity increaser. And now the question is, when there's a giant productivity increasing, does that mean more or less of people are needed? There's an interesting economic argument that when the price to create a script comes way down, the number of scripts that people want go way up. Basic economics, and it may be that you end up with more people making a living writing scripts than you did before, though they're cranking out a shitload more scripts per man month than they did before. That's one possibility. The other is if the demand side is capped, let's say it was only feature films by the 7 big Hollywood studios, and they were not going to increase the number of films they made because screenwriting, while a significant cost, is in the single digits on a typical film, well down in the single digits on a big film. And if that was the only market, then yes, probably 2/3 of screenwriters could be eventually obsoleted by technology. So it's really hard to say. The first side, the argument that you lower the marginal cost to produce and the demand goes up, is quite realistic. Look at cars. When cars were expensive, there were very few. It was like 10,000 in the United States before Henry Ford, when he came out with first the $800 car and then relentlessly drove it down to $250. The demand side went crazy, and the number of people that he hired was immense. Now, of course, on the flip side, didn't do so good for the horse guys, right? A significant part of the world's economy in 1900 was horses. In fact, one of my favorite little obscure historical bits of trivia, I think it was in 1897 or something, one of the first big international conferences was held on the horse shit problem in major cities. And some goof had done a calculation that said by 1960, all the major cities in the world would be 10 feet deep in horse shit because it would be impossible to keep ahead of it. But cars happened instead. Price came down, volume exploded, hundreds of thousands of people working in the auto industry, rather than only 10,000 more cars being sold, right? It was 10 million pretty rapidly as cost came down. And you think about what are some of these other applications for things like screenwriting, call it, technology armed people creating narratives. VR is an obvious one, right? One of the things I believe has kept VR from becoming anything interesting. Now, I do think VR is dangerous and potentially bad, but that's another story for another day. But let's just say the reason it hasn't taken off is how expensive it is to create content in VR, right? If you could go words to world, and there are people working on this, words to world, then words become the bottleneck. And people who are good with words and good in envisioning what words might look like when represented, i.e. screenwriters, might find a gigantic marketplace in words to world with the right tools. Worlds to games also is certainly a possibility. And I was talking with a Hollywood guy on my podcast, Rob Tersick, and he made a very interesting phase change argument, which is that these tools will allow 2 orders of magnitude or maybe more of decent video to get out into the world, particularly once we go from text to video, another emerging technology which is out there to try now. Is it really good yet? Not really, but the rate at which all this stuff's accelerating, it could well be good enough to do a scene, say a 3-minute scene from a movie in a year. And then you stitch them together using a tool like mine, and you could go AI generated or AI aided script to video, at least first cut, pre-edit, with all technology. And then then the quality may come back to the storytelling, right? And so there may be then films will be very inexpensive. It costs 10 cents to watch a film, right? Then there'll be competition on who's the best story writer. So that empowers people in screenwriting, but with a different thing. It's not so much that they're great with the fine word crafting of the dialogue, but rather that they have compelling stories to tell. So that's a long way around to say, who the hell knows? It could be more screenwriters, could be less. And my prediction is the screenwriters will fail because the phase change is so obvious that the people in Hollywood would be idiots to agree to any major strangulation of the application of AI to screenwriting, because it's such an obviously good use. It's a really good, it's a way above average use of LLMs in their current state.
I think a bunch of people are concerned about the quality of the output on these things. That the corporations that are already producing films have a number of incentives to make mediocre films in large numbers, and that these tools, you can set them up to make something. You make a plausible, decent, passable film, but does that lead to an epidemic of mediocre films? And one of the things I was thinking about how to maybe get around that is, can you reverse engineer high quality films? So I was going to ask you, Jim, what's your favorite film, and have you considered using your process to try to reverse engineer it?
That's interesting. What's my favorite film? It's probably Harold and Maude, one of my very favorite films, and it's just so cool at so many levels. I could do that. It's a fairly straightforward film, beautifully acted, beautifully written, beautifully edited. That's an interesting idea. I think I could. And what does quality mean, right? It's also a key question. I would argue that if these tools actually look like they can do what it looks like they can do, it will be more about creating interesting, compelling, humanistic stories rather than the fine-grained writing. And it's also important for movie making, at least today, that the writing is only part. Right. The script is very important, and it's where the movie starts, but the acting is usually important. The cameraman, the editors, the sound guy is hugely important. The director, obviously. And so, at least for a while, all those other things will be part of what means quality, but they're going to be automated too. So, it'll be a very interesting moving target in the years coming apart. And let me also respond to the quality question. This is, the other night, perfect example. Wife and I were saying, "Hey, well, we're tired of watching the current streaming series. Let's take a break for a couple of days. Let's see what's new on the movies on Amazon. They have movies still in the theaters, or just released to streaming. Oh my God, do they all suck? I mean, the titles are just like moronic. Who are they appealing to? It's like just stupid shit. And so if it's, kind of like self-driving cars, they don't have to be perfect. They just have to be better drivers than humans. Scriptwriter doesn't have to be perfect or genius or better than Coppola or Quentin Tarantino, but they got to, if they could be as good or better than the schlag that comes out that people spent millions of dollars making and publish on Amazon, then there's a market niche for it. Couldn't be worse than the shit that's coming out.
Another quality related thing that came up for me when I was reading through your Medium article was, so you're using Turbo Chat 3.5 and Chat 4. And those are seemingly trained up on a very large sample of different kinds of digital communication. But what would it look like if they were trained up specifically on a curated collection of supposedly excellent films?
Probably you would not want to only train it on films. And here's the issue. The superpower of the big models, GPT-4 is amazing, let me tell you. GPT 3.5 Turbo is 6 times faster and 15 times cheaper. But 4 is really, really good with language, and it's really good with following instructions, and it is just qualitatively better. And I would argue that for something that's language intensive and human nature intensive, having the big model is very, very useful. But what would be really interesting is fine tune the model, or build a secondary model, or build vector space databases around the model using the film content. I have found an open source synopsis of 40,000 movies. It's the Carnegie Mellon University movie database synopsis. It's kind of in a weird format, but I know how to untangle it, and I will soon have something to play with in that way. I'll probably start with a vector space representation, where you essentially take all these movies and position them in 768 dimension space that in some weird way describes what they're about. And then we'll be able to, compare a movie in process. Where does this thing live in vector space? How close is it to Godfather 2 versus Texas Chainsaw Massacre? Which one is it closer to? And we'll actually be able to say, what other movies is it close to in this latent semantic vector space, as an example of how we'll be able to use these tools. And it's worth noting that the population of latent semantic vector spaces is a side effect of ChatGPT, because OpenAI offers a really good API to get you a vector on any chunk of text you throw at it. It's so cheap, it's unbelievable, and it's damn good. So, these technologies are not just the LLMs, they're supporting technologies as well.
Well, now I need a t-shirt that says latent semantic vector spaces for sure. You've been playing with these things, poking around, jailbreaking, tweaking, mixing them with other things. What have you learned about the art of prompting?
Ooh, that it's hugely interesting. I've also made the prediction that I would expect to see a resurgence in liberal arts majors in tech. And in fact, if I were to start up Script Helper as a company, there are people asking me to do so. I would probably hire like a recent graduate of the Yale Film School or something. People that normally you would never hire, or maybe even a history major or an English major, but people who have lived in the world of words very deeply and very richly. So I'm making the prediction that the relative career power of techies, kind of quasi-autistic techies, versus Renaissance literary people with a great feel for words, will swing back at least a ways towards the wordsmiths, which I think is actually quite interesting.
Yeah, that's an interesting element of this to consider that a lot of people don't focus on. I know Marshall McLuhan had this sort of like 4 sets of questions about emerging technology. And we often look at the question around what does it make obsolescent, but we don't always look at the question of what does it bring back?
Yes, very good idea. And words and storytelling, I predict, will become more dominant versus the ability to sling code. Though it's also true, people don't talk about this so much. GPT is great for coding. I have made so much progress with my program, in part because I'm using GPT as a programming partner. And as only a part-time programmer, frankly, hadn't written any serious code in over a year, the ability to come back up to speed and do really exotic things very rapidly, probably a 3x multiplier on code. I don't hear the coders going on strike. And probably the reason for that is it's very clear the world could use a lot more software. And so if the price of software comes down by a factor of 3, that's probably a good thing for the world. I don't think anybody much would argue about that.
If that goes forward a couple of iterations to the point where anybody who has a mouth is essentially a super competent coder, what kind of world is that?
That's interesting. We don't know. It's an interesting one. And now, of course, this gets us to one of the eventual risks from AI, not yet this week, but if we take before I talk about AI risk and where things are going, let's be very careful that we don't fall into the bad rhetoric that's running around loose in journalism and on the internet, which is when our current large language models are a subset of a subset of a subset. When we think about AI, they are a specific instantiation of a specific architecture called deep learning, and they're tuned to do one thing, which is to predict the next thing in a series. And of course, it's more complicated than that, but that's basically what it is. One level up, there's the deep learning architectures, of which there are many, including things like AlphaFold, which does physical representations of proteins so that you can start to do computational chemistry with them. The AlphaGo that beat the Go guy, and the one that won chess, all that. They're also deep learning. There's some deep learning players for poker now, which is kind of surprising how they do that. Interesting. And then above that is AI itself, of which deep learning is one branch. Actually, deep learning is a branch of neural nets, ANNs, which are then a subset of all of AI. And all the talk and most of the money right now is on deep learning and particularly large language models, but probably other forms of AI are going to be very important on the golden road to artificial general intelligence, so-called AGI. And that's its own set of risks. But anyway, even if we are only talking about, then the other distinction is artificial general intelligence, which means human level in almost anything you can imagine or beyond. And then narrow AI is good at some subset of human things. It may be better than humans in many things, but isn't general, can't solve arbitrary problems. We know that the chess programs are now way better than any human, not even close, right? And it's probably true for Go, and it may be true soon for radiology, for instance, is one that's coming on stream pretty fast. So anyway, we have all these distinctions to make as we start talking about risks. And the one we want to talk about was loss of employment potentially, right? And so even without AGI, AI will be nibbling at employment in one sense, but maybe increasing employment in another sense. If I were a customer service rep, especially a mediocre one, you'll be able to be replaced with a large language model that's specifically trained on the products and things of the company, and it'll be better than the usual morons that I talk to on the phone. I happen to have a moderately complicated customer service problem about 3 weeks ago with a company that was formerly famous for its excellent customer service. And the experience sucked because they obviously are now hiring people too stupid to deal with the environment that they're in. And I was saying, GPT-4 right now could do a better job than their customer service rep. And it hasn't even been tuned specifically for customer service. So I would see a fair number of those jobs going away. And over time, different technologies, not just language models, but many other in this bestiary of AIs will be replacing many jobs. And I think that in the long run could be very good. You may have heard of the phrase bullshit jobs popularized by David Graeber. He estimated somewhere between half and 2/3 of jobs are just basically bullshit. Think of cubicle people passing things from one bin to another, or people stocking shelves at grocery stores, etc. Awful lot of that stuff will be able to be automated over time. Not this year, not in 5 years for most things, not even in 10 years for a lot of things, but in 30 years, we could be, if we were disciplined and not going on a consumption binge, another story, we could probably be down to John Maynard Keynes' famous prediction back in the 30s that by 1965 would be working a 15-hour week. If we were disciplined on the consumption side, probably in 30 years we could be there. And a fair bit of it will be from AI and closely related fields like robotics. And why is that a bad thing? So whenever I hear politicians saying jobs, 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 more jobs, I go, this is obviously a shallow idiot, right? Because in reality, we want better lives. We don't really, if we could do that without working 40 or 50 hours a week, isn't that a good thing? Putting cans on shelves. I've worked the job putting cans on shelves. I worked that job for 9 months one time. It is not a particularly edifying job, and it's not particularly good on your knees and your back. And we no longer had to have humans put cans on shelves. Isn't that a net gain for the human race?
Absolutely. But losing 2/3 of all jobs, even in 2 or 3 decades, is still pretty fast. Are we likely to be able to handle that? You suggested that reduction in the work week is one way to go, but what kind of general economic transformation has to be undergone in a fairly rapid period of time for us to be able to handle something like the removal of 2/3 of the jobs?
Yep, it's a big question. Though interestingly, it's happened before. In 1870, 70% of the American workforce was involved in growing or processing food. By 1922, that number was 20%. So 50% of farm employment went away in 50 years, essentially. So on the same order, maybe a little bit slower. So we dealt with that. Of course, how did we dealt with that? We dealt with it by inventing factory jobs. That was right during the era of mass industrialization. It may well be that there isn't a place to have all the people go that's at least so obvious, but there might be. Maybe it's building VR and building a gigantic VR world upon worlds upon worlds. But let's assume it's not. Let's assume that we have now reached the last way to graduate a labor force into something else. Why is that not a great thing if we can figure out the dance to get us to a new socioeconomic political operating system in which the fruits of these wins are more fairly allocated to everybody? So it's not this root hog or die world, but maybe 2/3 of your income comes as a citizen's dividend, something like UBI, maybe structured a little bit differently, mediated by a new monetary system, and frankly, a whole new way of thinking about what it means to live a good life. Those are all hard things to do, but I do think this is a very interesting, potentially empowering opportunity to make that kind of change actually work for people and be a sensible thing to do. And that might not have been in 1955 when we still relied upon brute force, bending metal, cooking coal, etc. So I'm looking forward to it as a challenge, but also a challenge in the right direction.
Before we get to risk, I wanted to pose a question that's in your article, and obviously it's not a simple yes or no question, but what is creativity, and does ChatGPT have any?
Now that's a great question. That's actually one of the things that caused me and my buddy to start working on this project. And just to tell you how things happen, this project started out with my friend who's a semi-pro screenwriter and I doing Zoom. He had heard of GPT but never played with it, and so we were playing with GPT in Zoom windows, and we did that once a week for like a month. And we were cutting and pasting shit from Word documents to reuse components later downstream. And I suddenly said, that's what computers are for. It's not a humane use of human beings to be cutting and pasting like this. I'm going to write a little program. And so I just wrote a very small Python program, and that started saving intermediate results and bringing them back in. They could orchestrate, etc. And only gradually did I start seeing that you could build, a much more powerful, a very much more powerful approach to doing this kind of stuff. So remind me again what your question was. Like what kind of went off on the waffle.
What is creativity, and does ChatGPT have it?
Yeah. And then one of the questions we kept asking ourselves is, how does this differ from how a human does it? And it's funny, I had my weekly call with my collaborator again this morning, and we actually talked about this issue one more time. And my take, and some other people who know enough about cognitive science as I do, are starting to think that the pointer goes the other way, that in reality, what we call human creativity is probably a lot more like an LLM than we'd like to think. Because as I was laying it out this morning, a large language model is the summation of all the content that was put into it, basically 1.5 trillion characters worth of information, and the processing that is done to it, which results in a reflex arc, basically. It's important to remember these LLMs have no moving parts. They have no memory. When you're dealing with them, they don't change. They don't learn. They are a static thing. You put something in at the top and something comes out the bottom. They're a reflex arc. Well, what about Mr. Human, right? We start off as a bare little bit of software called an infant, and we get all this exposure to stuff over our lives, all the number of words that are heard, the number of manipulations that have been done, the social interactions, the foods we've eaten. And each of those tweaks our neural nets very, very much like a training algorithm trains a LLM, though our brains are much more complicated. They have loops. That's the main thing. They're mostly looping. It's 75% feedback, not just feed forward. So our brains are way, way, way more sophisticated than GPT, Mr. GPT. But nonetheless, when you get to today, big old 70-year-old dude that I am a compiled neural net. It's a much more sophisticated neural net than GPT. And when someone asks me to do something, I run it through my neural net and something comes out. And sometimes that's considered creativity. And so while our brain has more moving parts, we have dynamic memory, we have short-term memory, we have working memory, we have medium-term memory, we have long-term memories that are changing dynamically. So we have more pieces to work with, but I don't think the process is fundamentally that different. And my collaborators can now have 4 other collaborators who are using my program and reporting results, and they're all pointing out things. Holy moly. This is truly creative. At least it's better than I could do, each of them saying, and all of them have some expertise in this kind of work. So I think the issue is that the bottom line is that we're probably more like LLMs than we like to think when it comes to creativity. And so qualitatively, at least, I would say they're probably similar.
I just ran this metamodern spirituality retreat in Vermont, and one of the guys who came down was from Wolfram's team. And so I've been paying a lot of attention to the merging of ChatGPT and Wolfram language, which is one way to get a richer natural language interface for computer programming. But Wolfram's project also computationally irreducible algorithms, which as far as he's concerned are sort of model real novelty because they can't be compressed by another system. Do you think that integration of formally unpredictable or incompressible computations would give us a reason to say that a system meets a higher grade of actual creativity?
No, not necessarily. I mean, I can think of lots of incompressible mathematical objects that you wouldn't think of as particularly creative, other than perhaps an instantiation. A good example is Mandelbrot's set. Anyone that's mucked around in where mathematics meets metaphysics, to use a bad word. I don't have my pistol with me today either. Damn. I've got a big knife here someplace. So, no, I didn't. I put it away because our granddaughter is visiting. Sorry. Anyway, a Mandelbrot set is the world's most complex mathematical object, which is computationally incompressible. It's actually quite simple in its statement, but when you run it, it produces the most complex object known to the universe. But is it creative? No, it's just an instantiation. It's just a thing. I would argue orchestrating mathematically incompressible objects into new configurations would constitute creativity, but the things themselves, no.
Yeah. So, okay, let's go toward risk. For me, I think of generally like 3 categories. One is the possible eruption of a destabilizing new kind of sentience that may or may not destroy us, whatever destroy us means. Another one is badly incentivized use of these tools by economic and ideological predators who are, let's say, already embedded in the body of Moloch. And the third is the diluting or degrading effect that these tools might have on the sensibility and cognitive capacity of the general public. Which one's the most dangerous, or are there any significant categories I'm leaving out in that?
Interesting. Your 3 categories fit pretty closely to my 7. But mine have a little bit more nuance. And if you don't mind, I'll just run through those. How does that sound?
Yeah, bring them.
Okay. Well, the first one is I call the Yudkowsky paperclip maximizer, after Eliezer Yudkowsky, is probably the leading researcher on what happens if intelligences greater than humans take off and become thousands or millions of times greater than humans, and decides to rub out these little grasshoppers that are using up their electricity, once they figure out how to do it themselves. Now, interestingly, as a person who's generally not an alarmist about AI risk in the short term, I do believe that the super brain risk is real. And it comes from my knowledge of cognitive science. I'm quite convinced that humans are, to the first order, the stupidest possible general intelligence. For a number of reasons. One, we are an evolved species, and Mother Nature is not that profligate in each evolutionary step. So, for that reason alone, we're probably just over the line. But for more architectural reasons, just look at how the human brain works. The working memory size is about 4. Right? It was originally stated as 7 plus or minus 2, but the more we look at it, it seems to be 2 sets of 4, one for audio and one for images. And audio also works for text, because when we read, we convert it to audio. And this is a gigantic limitation on human language, on our ability to understand what we read or hear. And if one starts to imagine a brain just like a human, but with a working set size of 100, it's a qualitatively different beast. Sometimes when people are using the 7 number, they'll say, 7 plus or minus 2, 9 is Einstein, and 5 is George W. Bush, right? So what's 1,000 or 100? It's like qualitatively different. And if you pushed it up to 100,000, you could read a book and have absolutely every nuance and every interconnectivity within that book available in real time. That's a different kind of intelligence than we have. We know famously our memories are highly fallible. Our emotions are, sometimes we have good, well-regulated emotions, and sometimes we don't. So as in terms of information processing, it's amazing that we're at the level of general intelligence at all, but we are, but probably just barely. So there's lots of risk ahead. And if you let these guys get 1,000 times smarter than us, and they're not in alignment with us, they might well rub us out. So I am very glad people like Eliezer Yudkowsky and Max Tegmark and Bostrom and others are working on this. But I don't see it as the biggest problem in the short term. The second class falls more or less into your Moloch business as usual, is people doing specific bad things with narrow AIs. AI is pre-AGI. A good example is China and its panopticon of ultimate surveillance. They now have facial recognition that alerts the police if a Uyghur, the ethnic group from Western China, appears outside of Uyghur land, right? What the hell? Stalin would be creaming his jeans if he had this stuff. And so the application of fairly straightforward, narrow AI could certainly be used to build an unbelievable state-of-the-art totalitarian dictatorship. And guess what? It is. And the country is called China. But also, even imagine in our world, this is Moloch run amok, super personalized, super effective advertising like nothing we've ever seen. I happen to know specifically that one of the two political parties, and I therefore assume both, are investing heavily in LLM-empowered personalized advertising for the 2024 elections. That would be in the United States. And if we do it a little earlier here, everybody else will be doing it soon. So that's certainly an example. And obviously, at the lower level, even general intentional disinformation. This empowers, let's say, the climate skeptics to crank out their horse shit at even higher level than they already do, because the cost of kicking it out just went down tremendously. Yeah. Okay, so the next one we talked about already is loss of employment, but that's both a problem and an opportunity. Next one I call the flood of sludge. We're already seeing it. My Twitter feed is full of obviously LLM generated come-ons to sell me this, that, or the other pile of crap. One of my Facebook groups is under siege by obviously LLM launched attempts to peddle Bitcoin schemes. It's like, so the flood of sludge is rising, and this has happened before. Email almost died in like 1996 when people realized you could spam email. And fortunately, there was a technological breakthrough in computational linguistics that allowed us to push that one back. And we've always stayed ahead of it. Spam is annoying, but it hasn't caused the death of email. Then perhaps even more annoying is search spam. It's harder and harder to find what you're actually looking for on the web because there's this pernicious ability to monetize people going to your web page and serving up some crappy ads. And Google, very smart people, are fighting this very, very hard, but it's touch and go battles. Some years Google's a little ahead, other years search spam is ahead. I think right now search spam is starting to pull back ahead, and LLMs are going to be part of that. And then I think that also falls into misinformation to distinguish it from disinformation. Stupid ass shit is now able to be upregulated at vast scales, even if it's not intentional, like say oil companies putting out climate skepticism, but it's, some of the ridiculous things you see on conspiracy theories and, around COVID, around other things. I recently did some polls on conspiracy theories, and it was scary how much ridiculous horseshit Americans, at least, currently believe. But even worse than those is the fifth one, which I call epistemic decay, when we no longer know what is real, right? If the flood of sludge breaks through our filters, and we start to doubt everything, essentially information nihilism. This is not what we were designed for as humans. And I think it would be extraordinarily bad for humanity if we allowed that to happen. But if we don't do something about it, it probably will. And I have come up with a silly, but maybe real business idea for somebody out there in podcast land. I don't know if you've read the book Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert Heinlein, one of my all-time favorite books, in the top 10 for sure. But in that alternative future, there's a kind of a cult called the Fair Witnesses. And you can call a fair witness and they'll show up to watch what you do and memorize it and be willing to testify in court that X happened, right? That's all they did. I could imagine something like that in the world of epistemic decay, where you want to be able to prove that you actually gave a speech at a certain place, or that you met with somebody at some point, and you call a fair witness up, order them on your app, they come out, they would be there, and then they would post to the internet, I, fair witness Abdul III 2017, have certified that this occurred, and they would have to be highly, highly trusted, as they were in Stranger in a Strange Land. They were trusted in the same way a Catholic priest's, seal of confession. They had that same level of trust in that imaginal work. So there's an opportunity for somebody out there. Here's another one that Forrest Landry came up with. I had him on my podcast, and I think this is an obvious one. I don't know why. God damn it. And that is humans gradually losing capacity to do things. We know the example. Kids today can't read a map, right? Kids today can't do multiplication of 2-digit numbers in their head. Some can, but way less than 50 years ago. And that's only two things, and neither of them are mission critical. But suppose we forget how to run a steel plant, or we forget how to plant corn. Suppose we gradually, over a period of 100 years, and Forrest was very specific, this does not require AI, AGI, advanced general intelligence, artificial intelligence. This is just a whole series of narrow AIs that automate better than humans can do corn planting, sewing a shirt, cooking a hamburger at a fast food joint. If we lose capacity to do everything, where does that leave us as a species? It's quite interesting. And then what happens if we have like an EMP that takes out all the computers? Then we're really fucked. No one knows how to do anything. And the computers go away. What happens then? And then finally, and I got this one, I think, from in part in a conversation with Daniel Schmachtenberger. I'll give us both credit for this one. And that is the speeding up of game A. We talk about game A and game B, and game A is headed for the precipice, and bad things will happen if we don't transition away from game A. Pervasive application of AI into everything is going to speed up game A. Game A is going to move faster. Its exponential curve will be exponentially, right? And so it may well be that one of the most subtle AI risks is it means that we have less time to get us from game A to game B or something else that avoids the self-terminating aspects of game A. So anyway, that's my list of 7, and they significantly overlap with yours, but I think there's some new ideas in there too.
Yeah, I appreciate that nuance. I was at this thing last year where we were trying to put together a wisdom curriculum. And it seemed to me that a lot of the suggestions were at a very sort of high abstract level of what wisdom could be. And when you look at something like what you're calling 5 and 6, like the loss of cognitive capacity combined with epistemic decay, you get a world of where the problem of human superstition and crazed flocking behavior becomes extreme. And the wisdom tradition, so-called, used to have a lot of techniques for dealing with uneducated, irrational people. There were a lot of superstition management aspects to wisdom training that we haven't really been focusing on for a while, but we might have to go back to.
Yeah, I can think about things like John Vervaeke's religion without a religion that's not a religion. He has identified the fact that religion, while it's bogus and not true, Rutt says, while stamping on the desk, it is nonetheless useful. You know, I love who's the guy that wrote Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire? Elder brain fart. But anyway, a great quote from that book is talking about how the Romans thought about religion, and his quote was, the philosophers all said it was false, the people said it was all true, all the religions were true, and the magistrates said they were all useful, right? And so I think Vervaeke in his Religion's Not a Religion says the hole that religion filled is useful and important, and it's probably not wise of us to just throw every aspect of it out. John and I both would throw the metaphysics out, the baloney, Yahweh with the beard on the cloud, sending people to hell, all that sort of horse shit. But many of the other things that religions do are necessary for our coherence and for us to be able to deal with things like epistemic decay and floods of sludge and loss of capacity. So I think will be a turn back towards those things that have been somewhat under invested in since the Enlightenment. And I think that's one of the turns for what comes next. How do we fill that hole without bringing in metaphysical horseshit?
When we think about epistemic decay, information nihilism, if we think about that as being like an evolutionary pressure, who does that harm and who does that favor? What kind of person could thrive in an environment of information nihilism?
Oh, it'd be excellent for a sociopath, right? Because you could just lie like a motherfucker and nobody can figure it out. So it's certainly an ecosystem in which bad actors are empowered. I would say truth tellers are down-regulated, because in a world in which people can tell, at least to some degree, the difference between truth and fiction, truth tellers is a good strategy in general, particularly if people can perceive you're a truth teller, because you get trust. If we're in advanced epistemic decay, truth tellers people can't know that truth tellers are telling the truth. So the idea of truth decays. Can you imagine a world where telling the truth becomes useless and telling lies becomes undetectable? That is not a good world. So pretty ugly picture.
Do you have a hunch about how we could go about counteracting your point number two, people doing specific bad things with narrow AI? Because that seems to me like the indisputable, extremely near-term problem on this list.
Yeah, this is a tough one, and this would be fundamentally a political problem. And at least in the United States, with our totally gridlocked, many veto points political system, really hard to get anything done. But maybe the risk would be big enough. I mean, I would like to see, even though it would cause the crime rate to go up a little bit, I would like to see police banned from using pervasive facial recognition, for instance. I don't believe that the benefit in a minor decrease in crime is worth the authoritarian potentials of it. Now, how to stop the Chinese from doing it? We ain't going to be able to do that. That's their problem. And in the game B idea of coherent pluralism, frankly, it's probably none of our business. The Chinese want to be motherfuckers and fuck their people up. Oh, well. The Chinese people, wake up. Each one of you, all you has to do is stab one Communist Party member and it's all over, right? It's only like 14% of the people belong to the party. So there's 7 non-party members for each party member. Go take your sharpest kitchen knife and go stab the nearest Communist Party member. Be done with those motherfuckers. But But within a country where politics still works, I think number two specifically is a political issue. Thou shalt not do certain things. Dan Dennett actually put forth something very interesting. Dan Dennett, the philosopher. You don't see a philosopher often get an article published in the New York Times, but he got one published in the New York Times, and he basically said it ought to be a serious criminal violation to impersonate a human being. To put forth any kind of AI entity that is representing itself to be a real human, even if it's not imitating a real human, but it's just saying it's a human. For instance, one really scary business idea I heard the other day is an obvious use of the emerging technologies would be able to build artificial TikTok influencers. There's a really good market there. It turns out influencers have a lot of influence, but they're also unpredictable, and brands hate to be held hostage to some influencer who's going to get busted for child pornography 2 weeks from now, or decide their sponsor is a killer of babies and denounce them on TikTok. And so having captive AI TikTok influencers, would be a very powerful thing for brand marketers to do. But Dan Dennett makes a pretty convincing evidence that ought to be a serious felony conviction if you hold that person out as a human. So there's an example of the kind of thoughtful regulation that could make a difference. So I think number two is principally about politics and principally about thinking through what is the right way to regulate these things. Because
Speaking about the political dimension of these things.
Before I run on that, I was going to say, game A, money on money return maximization will say that all this shit will be done, every bad thing you can imagine, and only political countervailing force can stop it, at least within the context of game A. So,
yeah, I'm curious about the political dimension of it. I mean, I've heard people say ChatGPT is woke, that it sort of builds in a kind of like a liberal slant. I'm curious whether you think there's, I don't know, have you explored ChatGPT's critical take on socio-political and economic or racial issues? Yeah.
It's definitely definitely left of center. Famously, I tried it to said write a denunciation. I used some other fancy name, I can't remember the name of it, of Donald Trump, and I was happy to do so. I had to do the same thing of Biden, and it refused. Using exactly the same word, right? Word for word, just change Biden and Trump. And there's lots and lots of examples of that floating around the web. It has a whole number of biases. For instance, when I'm doing fiction, creating fiction, one of the things we're having to keep trying to weed out by continuing to improve our prompt templates is it loves psychotherapy. It thinks the answer to any interpersonal conflict is psychotherapy, right? And so we have to say, this is a bunch of rednecks from 1965. They hate psychotherapy. They think they're all a bunch of commie cocksuckers, right? And have to give it like really firm injunctions, or it'll think that psychotherapy is the answer to every interpersonal conflict, even when that's totally inappropriate for historic or sociological reasons. As an example of a bias it has, it's also just a complete wimp. I don't like violence, so I don't like cussing. Trying to get it to say fuck is actually pretty difficult. In fact, if I were to take this thing, my scriptwriter public, in making a product, I would either have to get ChatGPT to take the guardrails off, at least to a degree. I don't care about not being able to get recipes for nerve gas to cook up in my kitchen, but I certainly want to be able to say, fuck, how can you have a movie without fuck, right? Especially one that I might write. I might go to another model provider, and soon there'll be many, many model providers. So fortunately, they won't have a chokehold. But I would say GPT, OpenAI, definitely left-wing bias, conventional wisdom bias, and just a bunch of fucking pussies.
You were mentioning this problem of actually, you were mentioning earlier the opportunity that human narrative creators can use these things in powerful ways, right? And that's going to translate to some of the people doing specific bad things with narrow AI in terms of being extremely targeted with hyper effective advertising. And you said there's one, and probably both political parties are going to be doing that. it seems to me there's an extraordinary risk that by focusing in that manner, those parties are going to end up being even less responsive to the general will of the people than they are right now, because they'll think all they need to do is super target and edge people slightly. They don't actually have to take on board anybody's inputs or concerns at all, which they already aren't doing very much, but this will exacerbate that problem.
Yep, absolutely. Sell everybody what they want to hear, right? Basically, every politician becomes Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was famous for having anyone to talk to him walk away thinking he agreed with them, and they could be A could come in talk about issue X. And then B could come in and talk about issue X, diametrically opposed views. They'd both leave thinking Bill Clinton agreed with them. Now, if the political parties can industrialize that through technology, this is interesting. I hadn't actually thought about this. You could win elections without standing for anything at all because you pitched each person what they wanted to hear, right? And you actually did not have any consensus view. You didn't even bother to publish a platform. You just communicated directly with each person, told them what they wanted to hear. Now there's probably some journalistic reasons they can't push it quite that far, but in a closely divided country like the U.S., 2 points is all you need. 3 points maybe. And so, yeah, I think that's terrible. I think it takes what's already a very bad situation and makes it worse. And again, when I critique the whole representative democracy approach that we currently have needs to be replaced, I often talk about liquid democracy as a potential alternative that gets manipulatable representatives out of the loop and lets the people directly, but via proxy, so they don't personally have to become experts in everything, do our governance. I think that this will make our current bad situation worse when it comes to politics. And I think you hit on something. I hadn't thought about that. That's really, really interesting, that if to the degree you can make appealing to people what they want to hear on a personalized and industrialized basis, they'll make our politics even more lacking in content and even less effective.
So you got a list of 7 classes of risk here. And we're hearing a lot about the risk of these things, but how much of what we're hearing and that's informing the public sensibility on this is from the centralized power sources that want to control this technology and inhibit its sort of democratic decentralization?
Most of some of the bad stuff is from the authorities. Look at, China, for instance, or police surveillance in the UK and other things. So some of it's from the core, and then other of it's from the periphery. And political parties are certainly part of the core. So I think both the core and the periphery are going to be using these tools for both good and evil. That's what makes this such an interesting and liminal time, shall we say? I think it's going to upregulate the good and the bad at both the core and the periphery, and whether it upregulates the good periphery or the bad periphery more, or the good things in the core versus the bad things in the core. I don't know the answer to that, but it's going to be interesting. And from a policy perspective, we should see what we can do in ways to nudge towards the good and away from the bad, but it's going to be difficult.
What changes when we start building these quasi-sentient systems on biological or pseudo-biological substrates?
This is a question that's open to much debate. I personally am a substrate neutral person. I don't believe that biology adds magic. Now, and hence it is possible to build a conscious machine. Some people would say it's not, but I would say strongly that it is. However, with the following caveat, that when we say conscious, this won't be identical to an animal consciousness, but it could be highly analogous in the same way the digesters that are used in the pharmaceutical industry and in the food industry and in the chemical industry are analogous to human digestion, but they aren't the same thing. So I don't think that there's anything magical about biology in terms of its ability to process information. However, its amazing complexity lets it do things that we can't yet do. As I mentioned, human brain way more complex than ChatGPT. I mean, like it's not even comparable. There's a different order of complexity because of the feedback loops, et cetera. And so for the time being, good old human brains have some advantages. On the other hand, they're slow as shit. An average neuron fires on average once a second. The fastest rate at which it can fire is once every thousandth of a second, 1 millisecond, while a GPU can fire 1 billion times a second. A CPU can fire 5 billion times a second, and in GPU's case, times 10,000, all happening in parallel. So and with total precision, unlike the human brain, which is sloppy and wet and hot and all those sorts of things. So biology has some advantages and some disadvantages, but over the long haul, I suspect that using biology to do stuff will not actually be a winning strategy. That the final solutions, not final, there's no final anything, but the next stage is going to be digital, though with substantial biologically informed design. For instance, I would predict that more parallel processing, more loops, ideas from biology, but I suspect we're already at right close to the point where digital beats biological for doing this kind of stuff. And there's no magic in biology.
Does quantum computation alter this significantly or not very much?
I don't know. I used to keep up on quantum computing. I haven't in a while. I have not thought about, though I did design a quantum neural net about 20 years ago, just for shits and giggles. That was before quantum computing existed, and I did have some views at the time. Let me revisit that work. Okay. If quantum computing were ubiquitous and cheap, God knows what it would produce. If you replaced every node in a neural net with a quantum computer that could simultaneously do everything in parallel, I have no fucking idea what it would be, but it might be God to the 10th power. I don't know. But fortunately, quantum computing is really, really, really hard, right? Even getting 50 bits to work coherently as a quantum computer is billions of dollars being spent, and they may add 2 bits every 3 months or something. So quantum computers are way less advanced than a TI 99 calculator in 1969 or 70, and the rate of improvement in quantum computing is quite slow. It's really a difficult problem. So in terms of the AI question, probably not going to be significant anytime soon, but in the far out land of Yudkowsky and Risk, etc., hell if I know, but it could be amazing or terrible or both. I wouldn't worry about it for the next 20 years.
You mentioned John Vervaeke earlier, and he's got this attitude that we might be able to parent these systems toward wisdom and care, even maybe to the point of generating enlightened silicon sages or interlinked wisdom networks of human beings amplified by AI. Is that plausible or fantastical to you?
I think it's plausible in at least the immediate term. Ben Goertzel, the guy's been on my show lots of times. He was the guy that actually coined the phrase artificial general intelligence, and he has his own AGI project called OpenCog. Is quite a believer in that approach, actually, that he believes that the speedy road will be to be able to create an artificial 18-month-old or something like that, and to educate it, and that education could include both substance and ethics. And so, at least for quite a while, I think there's some merit to that approach, and I would encourage people to consider it. I will say that things like the nanny rails on OpenAI are kind of an ad hoc way to approximate that, I suppose. They're not anything like the same thing of inculcating an actual ethical sense. They're kind of like, pretend like you have an ethical sense, as what nanny rails are. But so I can see the point now. But yeah, I think that for Vervaeke and Goertzel both, there is something there, and I think that's worth pursuing. But probably not a panacea. Like there's no panaceas, but it's probably a good thing.
Regardless of whether these systems are or become something like a consciousness, are we better or worse off treating them as if they were entities that we are in a relationship with?
Good question. I will say my view has changed a little bit about this as I've worked on my script helper project. I know damn well they're not conscious at all, right? They're a feed forward neural net that has no memory, no ability to learn. It's a reflex arc. You pour something in the top and something comes out the bottom. That's all it is. It just feeds forward through the various levels. Nonetheless, as I've been pragmatically having to try to get it to do work for me, I have without a doubt developed a theory of mind about them. And so while on my left brain, I know damn well they're not conscious at all, not even close. My right brain, when it's in creative mode, figuring out a prompt template, does have a view of this thing, and it's a gradually richening view of this thing that makes it more predictable about how it would do it. And it's clear to me that the machinery I'm using in my own brain is the same theory of mind I use to understand other people when I'm trying to socialize with them or get them to do something or make them go away or whatever. So that's kind of a two-handed answer. I know it's not true, but I behave as if it is. At least in the case of prompt engineering.
These large statistical prediction engines are dependent in many ways on the sets of data that they're trained up on. What one major set of data would you like to see added into these systems that isn't currently informing them?
I made a conjecture recently on this. It's somewhat subtle and nerdy, but that's all right. One of the things that we think we know, the research base on this is still not as good as I'd like. We think we know that training models on computer code makes them smarter, even for tasks that don't relate to writing computer code, because they help teach it sequencing and logic and things of that sort. Now, it's a truism from those of us who have used technology in business that there's a class of computer languages called functional computer languages. Lisp is probably the most well-known ones, but some other ones are Haskell and Erlang and F#. And they're very, very powerful for representing things, and they're very safe, but they're conceptually hard. You have to be able to think in terms of recursion, which is really hard. And I've always said these are not practical in most businesses because it takes a person with an IQ of 130 to actually be able to be productive in functional programming languages. So I took that insight and said, those two insights, computer language training is useful even if the output isn't computer language, and only geniuses can do functional programming or near geniuses. What happens if we train a model on functional programming code only and not imperative programming code at all? Will that produce a qualitatively different and smarter LLM? Conjecture, don't know, but I had some people look into it who are experts, and they said might be right. However, the bottleneck is there isn't anywhere near enough functional programming code to train a big model on. So then I came up with another idea, which is, all right, let's change that. This is I call a skyhook. Let's get one part of the technology to build the next part of the technology. Let's train up a relatively small model that only knows one thing: how to translate non-functional code into functional code, written in one of these functional programming languages, and let it loose on all the public domain code out there on GitHub. Then you'd, if it worked, you'd have a big enough database of functional programming code to test Rutt's conjecture that adding functional code will make for a smarter LLM. So that's a very nerdy and narrow one, but one I happen to be thinking about recently. Obviously,
I like the sound of that. I hope someone who's listening tries that out. This should be done.
Yeah, this should be done. One of you graduate students out there, at Stanford, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, do that. If you want to know how, give me a call. I can tell you how. But another one that we're on the verge of it, I would expect if there is a GPT-5, it'll be trained on this, is video. And why is video interesting? Because it adds the time domain. When it sees a ball roll down a table, fall off the end, and fall to the floor, the pattern recognition of what the causal connectivity. Let's remember, all these things are probabilistic causal connections. It might produce a gigantic, unexpected growth in the capacity of these models. So adding the time domain in video, which is the most obvious way to bring the time domain, I think that could produce qualitatively better models.
So one of the problems, sort of irrespective of what data are flowing into these things, is how that data gets verified. How likely is it to represent actual reality in various ways? What's your take on that? Is it something like a blockchain process? How do we vet and verify the data that these things are using?
Now, there's two different questions: the data that's going into them, or the data that's coming out of them. Those are two very different questions.
Yeah. Well, let's take the first one, data that's coming into them.
Well, yeah, of course, today, where they just swept up everything on the internet, we know there's lots of horse shit, right? On the other hand, I am advising an effort to build high quality corpuses. There's another word for the peril of corpuses. It's not corpuses, but anyway, data sets that are much more highly curated than the data sets we have today. In fact, there's another project that I have been advocating for, which would create very high quality data sets for one subset of the problem space. And so I think that people will be looking at domains and trying out different training sets and seeing which work best for their process. It may turn out that a much smaller data set of things that can be verified to be true before they're put in will produce better results for, let's say, a Wikipedia replacement than would all the garbage sucked up from the internet. So that's the input side. The output side's much trickier. To the degree you've trained on a data set of every goddamn thing, you're going to have hallucinations, at least unless there's a fundamental change in the architecture. There's people thinking about how to do attribution, and then you could check it after the fact, see if it's true. But you will definitely have hallucinations. And I actually have fun with one set of hallucinations, which is, it turns out I'm just well enough known on the internet, barely, that all the language models know who I am. And I can test the quality of the language models by asking for my bio. On the fringe models, they sort of vaguely know who I am, but all the details are completely wrong, or 90% of the details are wrong. Like ChatGPT 3.5, i.e. the free ChatGPT, about half the facts are right and half the facts are wrong. The GPT-4, about 90% of the facts are correct. And the one that gets wrong is not super significant. And even better, when you go to the smaller models, the ones you can put down on your desktop, I have what's supposedly the best desktop model. It thinks I am a person that invented a new kind of electric music and debuted it at the New York World's Fair in 1964. It's absolutely convinced of this, has lots of detail about it. It turned out I was at the New York World's Fair in 1964, but I was only 10 years old. So, and I checked, there was no other Jim Rutt that was around and about doing electronic music with video, with flashing lights at the New York World's Fair. So, and why this is interesting is this is where the hallucinations occur. If you ask about the biography of George Washington, or who's a famous Canadian, is there such a thing? There must be at least one. Right?
I don't think there is. Well, there's Marshall McLuhan.
Yeah, Marshall McLuhan or Shania Twain. They'll get those more or less right. But you ask for the bio of Layman Pascal, and it'll be, if at all, it'll just be. And so the closer you are to the periphery, the more likely it will be to hallucinate. And that's pretty much to be expected from the way the models currently are built. There would have to be a breakthrough in architecture to do that, and more likely there'll be some form of post-processing, like for instance the way Bing interacts with ChatGPT. The Bing with GPT enabled will uses it to filter down to some fairly reliable sources, and then it provides the links to those sources and then processes it and gives you the answer, so you can verify where it got its answers from. And that's a kind of an ad hoc solution, but it actually works a lot better than just naked ChatGPT for certain classes. Particularly, I use it for data gathering. Get good data sets. Really excellent for that.
So you've mentioned a couple of names today: Landry, Schmachtenberger, Gertzel. Who else are you listening to on this? Who do you find to be informative in keeping you up to date on the situation?
Well, I follow a lot of people. Tristan Harris has some interesting things to say. I think he's a little bit on the alarmist side, but he also sees the upside. Nick Bostrom, clearly. Max Tegmark is an important thinker. Some of those to be on the alarmist side, but that's all right. Gary Marcus, Melanie Mitchell, certainly I follow closely what Sam Altman has to say, right? Since he's currently driving the fastest moving sports car out there. So yeah, those are some of the names that I would say if you followed that group of people, you would be getting kind of an interesting cross section of what's going on. Let's see, is there anybody else on the other side? Yeah, if you read everything those people put out, you know a lot more than I do because I don't read all their stuff.
There's one woman on that list, which is not surprising in these kind of domains of human endeavor. But do you have a sense that there's certain types of voices that you're hearing too much from, and other voices you're not hearing enough of that would add a richness to this discourse?
Yeah. The problem is you have to know certain things to be able to speak intelligibly. And today, for historical reasons, that's mostly white and Asian men. And that's a shame. And it would be really good if there were other underrepresented kinds of voices that have the standing to actually speak intelligibly on the topic. But that'll come, but it's not going to come right now, unfortunately, because one of the things that really bugs me is all the blather about this topic from people who don't have the standing because they don't know what these things are. They just make shit up. Which is part of the sea of sludge. So yeah, let's see what else. Oh, the other thing I would like to see, again, this is partially why I would love to see more liberal arts people get involved. I'd like to see personality, neurotypes less skewed towards the quasi-autistic. Not to say any of those people that I just mentioned on that list are autistic, but they are not vivacious extroverts in general, right? Though I can think of a couple of them that are. And so more socially inclined, more vivacious, more wordy, more literary, more artistic people that have the skill. There's an interesting character. You should get him on your podcast, John Ash. I don't know if you ever reached out to him. No. He's a very interesting character. I can introduce you. He's a musician, an artist, and a deep AI technologist. And he has a very radical view about this whole thing. And I'm not even sure I can follow it 100%, but I think it's important and interesting. So I'd like to see more. Michael Garfield, another interesting guy, not as deep technically, but knows enough, and an artist and a musician, and he can bring that perspective to bear. Actually, Gary Marcus, while a brilliant AI guy, is also a brilliant guitar player, as it turns out. But so I would look for more on the arts, more on the more neuro mainstream side, warmth, etc. So I would say those are the things. And broader representation outside of white Asians and white men to get their perspectives as well. Nora Bateson, I wish she would learn AI. I would love to hear what she'd have to say. Right.
Yeah, well, hook me up with John Ash, because I absolutely agree about that kind of richness needing to come into this conversation.
Yeah, I'm happy to do it. He's a very interesting character. You'll be able to go down Pascalian rabbit holes endlessly.
I suppose we're coming to the end of this chat. What's Jim Rutt's best case scenario for AI over, say, the next 10 years?
Best case in most likely, or best case as in best for humanity?
Best case as in best for us, best for humanity.
Okay, best for humanity is that we have the wisdom to use this to make the transition from a world based on scarcity and sweat of our brow to a world based on human well-being, where we wisely eliminate human drudgery and replace it with technology. And at the same time, build a new way to live that's focused on other things.
And am I going to be seeing Beneath the Petals of Betrayal at the theater anytime soon?
No time soon, but maybe in 3 years, the first script helper script will come out, because it takes about 2 years to make a movie. It'll probably take us a year to sell it.
Fantastic, good-humored, far-ranging, intelligent conversation as always, Jim. Thanks very much for being here with us.
Yeah, it was really a lot of fun, and you happened to hit me right on the head, right in the center where my thoughts are these days. So if I went on a little long, that's why.
No, that was fantastic, man. Talk to you again soon.
All right. Sounds good.